So today I would like to discuss, we discussed a lot about Rabbi Reish Lakish and Edom Achasum Malashtar. Today I'd like to begin a discussion about another important analysis in the Gemara about Eid Echad Neman B'Isurim. So let's go through the Shakla V'Tarya very quickly on Gimel Amud Aleph here. Or Beis on Beis, same thing actually. Gimel Amud Aleph we're more familiar with.
Gimel Amud Aleph, 1 second.
Gimel Amud Aleph or Beis on Beis. Either way, we're jumping around a lot. We were on Vav Amud Beis. We were talking about Rambam and the Noda B'Yehuda and the Pnei Yehoshua and so on. But now I want to catch up with this topic. This is a very important topic. Let me explain the background of the topic. So all year we've been speaking about the requirements of evidence. Eidos, witnesses, and we've talked a lot, especially about the relationship between oral testimony and a contract, which is written testimony, right? And the last three or so or four shiurim have been on the institution of contract law, you could call it, which is, the cornerstone of which is Reish Lakish's statement that Edim Hachasumim Alashtar, the two witnesses that sign on a contract, on a document, it's if they are witnesses who were present and can testify about the event, even though that's a virtual, not a real statement in many cases. And it's as if they were also interrogated in Bezdin and found to be authentic. So whether we're speaking about oral testimony, al pi shnayim or shlosha edim yakum davar, or yumas hameis, different psukim, or we're talking about edus bishtar. In both cases, we're talking about this, highest rung, if you will, the most rigorous requirements of evidence. And as we've discussed in the past, Trei Kameya, meaning when you have two witnesses that attest to something, that is considered to be factual in the halacha. Maimed Har Sinai, which we just celebrated in Chag HaShavuos, the giving of the Torah, everything that went along with it, the moment of revelation. So that took place at a glorious moment in history, and it's the linchpin of our religion and everything that we hold dear, of our relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, of our commitment to the halakha. So the Rambam and Ramban, and earlier sources too, but Rambam and Ramban are as authoritative as you can possibly get, and they are very concerned with these kind of issues. So the Rambam in Hilchos Yisodei Torah, the Ramban in his drasha Torah Hashem Tamima, and in other places throughout his work on the Torah, echoes what the Rambam says, which is that in the end of the day, our connection to that magical linchpin moment of Maimed Har Sinai, of Gilui Shechina, or the Ribono Shel Olam, impossibly, revealed himself, appeared, to, physical human beings. All of that is, connected to us because Klal Yisrael were there, and the edus of Klal Yisrael, the Dora Doros, the testimony, were they were witness, and every generation hears about it. So that's not the evidence of court. It's more and it's less, but it's to demonstrate that in the halacha's thinking, whenever there's evidence, it's factual. Now, again, the halacha recognizes that some people are delusional. The halacha recognizes that some people are deceitful. And therefore, when two witnesses come to court and they say something, on a practical level, we all understand that, this could be fantasy, or it could be, some sort of a hoax, deliberate hoax with some sort of agenda. But all of that is set aside until there's evidence of it, because testimony is considered to be foundational, and it's considered to be factual, it's considered to be 100% until we know otherwise. Again, there's something called the din meruma. I'm just giving you a little bit of background. The Gemara is in Masechet Sanhedrin, and the Rambam codifies this as well. That sometimes, like the judges, especially trained judges, practiced judges, they develop an instinct for what's known as din meruma. There's something, fishy. Their instinct is that something is off. There's something untoward in this particular case. And in those circumstances, they have added license to, kind of investigate, to neutralize, the ADIM, because they feel that, the system is being exploited. I'll just add, the institution of Hazama, which is, basically the idea that, sometimes you have witnesses that come to court, they testify, and then you have two other witnesses who counter them. There are two ways to counter the witnesses.
Imanu Ayitem.
One way is called hakchasha, or trey, two and two against two. Hakchasha means contradiction. When you have a contradiction, trey, so then you're stymied. And even then, there's some really interesting questions about how to break that deadlock. Can you break that deadlock? Trey sveika daraisa, trey sveika drabanan. Many different Gemaras and discussions about that. But at least if there is conflict about the facts of a case, two witnesses, Reuven and Shimon, show up in court and they say, this event took place. A, lent money to B. And then Levi and Yehuda show up in court and they say it's not true. We were to say we were there, it didn't happen. That's called hakchasha. That's called trey, two against two. But there's something called hazama. Hazama is when two people come to court, they testify, and then two other people show up in court. Instead of saying it didn't happen because they don't know one way or another, they say we don't know whether it happened or not. But what we do know is that these two people cannot possibly give evidence honestly about this case because they were with us, in another location. I usually pick Chicago, but it doesn't have to be Chicago. It could be anywhere. But basically, imanu hayisem ba'oso ayom ba'oso shah. In other words, if they say, listen, we were we were with you in some other city or some other location, you couldn't possibly know what happened in Midtown Manhattan if we were with you at that exact moment, in North Carolina or Chicago or Israel or whatever. That's called hazama. And we believe the Edom Zomimim. We'll get back to this point. But the point I wanted to bring up was the Edom Zomimim suffer, are treated, very harshly. We say vasisem lo kasha zomam lasos lachit. If it's a capital crime, if Reuven and Shimon are testifying, that someone killed someone, right? And then Levi and Yehuda come to court and they're Edom Zomim, and they say you couldn't possibly know, and that's established. We believe Levi and Yehuda. So the Reuven and Shimon, the Edom, are face the death penalty. Vasisem lo kasher zamam la'asos lachib. We do to them what they tried to falsely accuse, or execute, the defendant. That's very harsh, obviously. And the assumption is that that if they're being accused of lying, that they are liars. So the Sefer Chinuch has a comment. I'll give you one other piece of information. The Torah in Devarim, in the end of Devarim, in Parshas Re'eh and Shoftim, uses an expression, roughly the same expression, 4 times. It's called Arba Tzrichin Achraza. This is a Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin and Daf Pei Tes Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, Arba Tzrichin Achraza. 4 people, their fate needs to be publicized. What does that mean? Mesis, the instigator, Zaken Mamre, the rebellious elder, Ben Sora or Mora, the rebellious, or gluttonous child, and Edom Zomin. In all these cases, the Torah uses the expression Kol Yisrael yishma'u v'yiro v'lo yazidun od. That it's not enough to punish, once you have evidence against. The masis is somebody who tries to incite someone else to avodah zarah, to idolatry. He says, come with me we'll bow down to the idol together, we'll have a good, experience. That's called a masis. The Zaken Mamre is somebody who is a Talmud Chacham and a Mora Hora. He's somebody who's, worthy to render halachic decisions on a very high level, but he refuses to accept the authority of the Supreme Court of the Jewish people. So that basically he is, using his elevated stature, authority, and position not to, support, but to undermine, the authority of the high court. Again, he can, if he so chooses, if he believes that the high court is in error, he can lobby, he can write many articles, he can try to convince everyone, but there's a certain protocol and procedure. We say, mishpat echad yalachem. He's not allowed to flout the authority of the Beis Din HaGadol. And if he does, then he's subject to the death penalty. And again, the Torah says, Kol Yisrael yishmu v'yiro v'lo yazidu od. Not only does he get punished so severely, but like the masis, we publicize his punishment. And the other one is the ben sora or mora. You have a child, he's not even an adult, but he already does terrible things. His behavior is more than incorrigible. We say nidon al shem sofo, that his behavior and his relationship to his parents reflects that he's a dangerous, he's a danger to society. And the Gemara says that, ben sora mora l'hoy v'lanivra, that the conditions for creating a ben sora mora, it's more of an abstract case, or it's a debate whether it's an abstract case. But either way, there too, the Torah says, Kol Yisrael yishmu v'yiro v'lo yazidu od. Why am I telling you all this? So the fourth case is Edom Zomimim. There too, the Torah uses the expression, the Kol Yisrael yishmu v'yiro v'lo yazidu od. When two people come to court and they say, you couldn't possibly, be telling the truth, you couldn't possibly be witnesses in that case because you were with us in a different place. So we say, Vasisim lo kashazamam la'asosach. We give them a punishment that they were trying to impose, tit for tat, quid pro quo. They were trying to cause this person to lose $1,000. They're going to lose $1,000. Worse, they were trying to cause this person to lose his life. They're going to be executed for trying to do that. That's Edom Zomim. And again, the Torah uses the expression, Kol Yisrael yishmu v'yiro v'lo yazidu od. So the question is this. The other three cases we understand, they're very severe infractions. They represent like a certain danger to the total Klal Yisrael. And, nationally, a ben sora mora, somebody who would flout the authority of his parents in such a, in such a explicit and rebellious way. The rebellious elder, shloya kishtei toros, the masis who incites to avodah zarah. We understand why it's not enough to punish them, but you want to publicize it as well. But why the Edom Zomimim? That doesn't seem to fit the other three. But the Sefer Chinuch has a line in which he says that the reason that it's included in that group is davar gadol v'chomorhu. He doesn't explain why. He just says this is a, colossal, and weighty and significant infraction. That's what the Sefer Chinuch says. More so than many other things. But I'll give you my take. My take on it is as follows. We invest so much reliance on the kashrus, on the cheskas kashrus of two witnesses. We treat them as if what they're saying is factual truth. As I say, our reliance on the authenticity of the revelation is based on edus. But more to the point, any time you go to court and Ploni and Almoni show up in court, two people you don't even know who they are, but they have a cheskas kashrus as kosher Jews, unless we know otherwise, we believe them. The Gemara says in the end of Masechet Bava Basra that if Moshe and Aaron showed up in court, we wouldn't believe them because they're brothers and they're psulim le'edus. We have very high standards for witnesses. We don't allow relatives, even relatives who who do we trust more than Moshe and Aaron, right? In terms of being honest, credible, sources. The Gemara says it doesn't matter. Gzeres HaMelechi, where we put in place very rigorous standards for Eidos. Why did we do that? The answer is, so there's a certain dialectic in Eidos. On the one hand, we have very high threshold, very high standards. And the reason for that is so that we can rely on these people by applying a cheskas kashrus, by the presumption that they are, legitimate, honest, Jews, and then we treat what they say as eidos as if it is absolute truth, until we know otherwise. So Edom Zomim is a davar gadol and a davar chamor because, in a way, these people who couldn't even be witnesses, right? They cynically present themselves as if they are. So what they're doing is they are exploiting, the idealism of the system, in the most cynical way possible. The system is ideally accepting any Jew, who is a kosher aid, or any two in combination. They're not related to each other. They're not excluded for some other reasons. So in a very idealistic way, that cheskas kashrus gives them a status of Eidim, and we treat as factual what it is that they're saying. And then these two Eidim Zomim come to court, and they weren't even in the same city at that time. So we consider that to be such an offense. It's such a cynical manipulation of the idealism of relying on cheskas kashrus, on the reliability, the default reliability, we'll call it, of the witnesses, that it puts them in a category alongside Mesis, the inciter, Zaken Mamre, the rebellious elder, and the Ben Sora Mora. And that's why it's not enough to punish them. Their punishment is like an object lesson, I guess you'd call it, for all of Klal Yisrael. Kol Yisrael Yishmu V'yiro, V'lo Yizidun. So why am I telling you all this now and in this context? I'm trying to emphasize in all sorts of different ways that Eidos is a very remarkable institution with high standards, but also the high standards are connected to the high degree of credibility, not just credibility. As I say, we treat Eidim as if what they are saying is factual unless or until we have suspicions, that fall under the rubric, of questioning or challenging, that threshold standard of testimony. So now the question is, let's say you dip below that. Let's say you don't have, there are many issues in life and in halachic, in life and law and in halachic law, where we need to rely on people's say-so, right, on their credibility. So if you have two witnesses, meaning ksherim, not krovim, not psulim, two eidim ksherim, what I've just spent the last 10 or 15 minutes, trying to establish is that, the halacha has a very elevated, very idealistic perspective on the stature of eidim and the authenticity of the edus that they convey. But let's say you fall short of that. Let's say you don't have two, kosher witnesses. So even in our discussion, of the previous topic, it's already come up. There's another category, or there are a bunch of other categories, and that's what I want to analyze. So one of those categories is Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Isurin. And that is when it comes to matters of Isur and Heter, all things being equal, you don't need two witnesses or two kosher witnesses. You could rely on the principle of nemanus, of credibility, and that would require only a single witness. And according to most sources, one of the things that we're going to discuss, the source, one source, or the one witness doesn't have to be a formal kosher witness either. Krovim, a Korov, a relative, would be fine. Russia is a little bit of a different issue. For example, women are typically excluded from testimony because for them to be Adim, they'd have to also, be forced, to come to court. So that's one explanation. But either way, women are excluded from, testimony in Bezdin. But according to most sources, when it comes to echad nemon be'isurim, a single aid is believed when it comes to matters of isur v'heter. Of course, there's no distinction between men and women. There's no distinction between krovim and rechokim, etc. So what we're trying to figure out is two things. Number one, what is the characteristic relationship between eid echad be'isurim and shnayim edim b'mamon ubedavar shebe'erva, etc.? Is one edus and the other namanus, and what does that mean? I mean, one is testimony or they're witnesses, and the other is simply credibility, believability, etc. That's question number one. I mean, how do these things work differently? The first, testimony, witnesses, that has a connotation and a framework, for example, of Bezdin, of the court system. Typically, where you require Adim, you require that the Adim appear in the presence of judges. It's part of a whole apparatus, a whole framework of the the halakhic judicial system. Whereas typically, we'll discuss exceptions going forward, Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim is a much more, in addition to the threshold being lower, is one and not two. It doesn't need to have, Adim Ksherim. In addition to that, it's a much more informal setting, context as well. Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim doesn't have to take place in a bezdin. Question that we'll look at eventually, not tonight, is if there is Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim in the presence of a bezdin, and maybe by Adim Ksherim, does that catapult? Are there like levels or gradations, within Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim? I'll talk about other gradations in a minute, but there's a whole hierarchy of credibility, of reliance on others in the halacha. I'm giving you so far two examples: Shnayim Edim bebezdin, Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim chutz lebezdin. Soon it'll be clear that there are categories, that are parallel to Eid Echad B'Yisurim, and there are categories in between Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim and Shnayim Edim. So the question that we're interested in is: are these differences fundamental? Is testimony in Bezdin, witnesses, is that all about creating a fact? That is, indisputable. Whereas the issue of nemanus is about credibility, believability, reliance, not so much on a fact, but just on the individuals themselves. Number one, and two, if there is that difference, how much certitude do we invest in this credibility of Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim? Is it like, do we consider it to be, reliable? Do we consider it to be a risk that's worth taking? And for example, how does it stack up against other factors, that go into making decisions that we rely on, but there are, not 100% at all, where there are exceptions. For example, we have a principle of azlinan basa rov, right? Probably in halacha, sometimes we base things on probability, right? Where you need edus, probability isn't good enough. But in many areas of halacha, probability is very effective. Azlinan basa rov. Sometimes we rely on what's known as a chazaka. A chazaka is a presumptive state. So if there was a certain status, the presumptive state, or the presumption, is that status continues until default, until we know that it doesn't. Like if you have a mikvah shenimdad, v'nimtza chaser, let's say you have a mikvah and somebody checked it, and it was fine. You don't have to keep checking it every minute. But if you have a mikvah and somebody checked it and it was fine, you don't have to keep checking it every minute. right? Unless something happens, the presumption is that if it was fine, then it's fine. But if it's, if it was measured and then it turns out that, there's not enough liquid, not enough, water in the mikvah, and now we're trying to figure out, oh, well, the last time we checked it was 6 months ago. So between now and 6 months ago, at some point it became invalid. So the presumptive, state of the mikvah at any point between now and the 6 months that that in which we knew it was proper, becomes a very interesting question. So my point is, Eidech Neman Bisurim is like a lower form of edus, or form of edus, given the the context and the subject matter, or it's more like a rove or a chazaka or something like that, in which case we know that there are holes, but given the stakes, the Torah allows us to rely on an. Okay, so those are the questions I want to consider, and this is also related to two other questions. Sometimes the lines between Eidecha Neman Be'isurim and Edus are very blurred, meaning there's ambiguity between these two lines. For example, let's say, I'll just give an example. Let's say a case of Yibum. We might just learn, we're probably going to learn Second Yevamos next year. So get a heads up, let's say Yibum. Yibum is a situation where the a husband dies. There are no, he didn't produce any children in the marriage, and there's a brother, right? So the brother, who normally would be prohibited to marry his sister-in-law, but in this case, as a mitzvah of Yibum, right, he's obligated either to do chalitza or to be miyabim, to continue the brother's marriage with her. Okay, so let's say you're not sure who the brother is, meaning Ruvain was married to Sarah. Ruvain died. It didn't have any children. We know Ruvain has a brother, but we don't know who he is. So identifying the brother, Shimon, as the Yavam, is that Eidecha Neman Be'isurim, or is that what we call Ein Davar Shebe'erva Pakos Mishan? Right? Because Yibum is erva, or it's all about it's a form of marriage, basically. So the identification of the brother, what the Gemara calls in Masechet Yevamos on Daf Lamed Tes, Ishtemo de'inhu. The Gemara seems to say a single aid can identify the Yava, even though the effect is Davar Shebe'erva. Or I'll give you another example. There are many examples. The Gemara says in Masachet Kiddushin, the Mishnah in Kiddushin, and so on, says, let's say a person appoints a shliach, an agent, and he sends him out. He says, you know what? Go find me a wife. Okay, either he has a lot of confidence in the agent, or he's not very picky. So he doesn't tell him who. Now, this is probably an abstract case, but it does make a difference. It's an interesting case. So he says, go find me a wife. And he's not, meaning he leaves it to the judgment of the shliach. Anyways, you understand what happened here, of course.
Yeah, but the shliach can't make the kedushin on behalf of the. Don't you have to go through the process?
Yeah. Ha'ish mekadesh bo b'shlucho, ha'isha miskadeshes bo b'shlucha. Shlichus works in kiddushin. Well, you've never been to a wedding where the chassan and the kala were not there?
So it works for the kedushin,
I'm joking
not for the
about
nesuin. Not for the nesuin. In other words, it works for
the kiddushin. The kiddushin.
Right. So just the eris.
There are two phases in the ishus. That's a great point.
Right.
We're only talking about but what makes her an Eishes Ish is the kiddushin part. And I was only being humorous, or I was attempting.
No, I know
about whether or not any of you have been to a wedding where the chassan and kala were not there and done by you. I'm looking forward one time to going to such a wedding. But
our artificial intelligence is coming. But what about with?
Well, probably artificial intelligence is probably possible l'shlichos. Yeah. But anyways,
Got it. But isn't there a quality going back to Eid Echad? Like, don't we distinguish between different Eidim? Like if you're eating at home at a very religious meaning at your home, most people will eat at, but different people homes they might not. Meaning different Eid Echads have different credibility, right?
Well, if somebody is
they're not equal.
Right, your point. We're going to get to that, but this is a Gemara that we discussed like 3-4 years ago. We learned Chulin. If somebody is a chashud al a davar, then you may not believe him. If somebody is known not to be careful about certain standards, then
Right.
It's possible that you don't trust him to speak about those standards, because from his point of view, it's meaningless. Like he thinks it's a joke, or doesn't care. So then it's not a matter of
or he doesn't even know what kosher is. Like people invite me to your house.
Then for sure. No, of course. If he doesn't have the competence because he just doesn't know, then there's nothing to talk about, right? I'm saying even if he did have the competence, but he doesn't have the seriousness, because for him it's like it's he doesn't care about it, so he doesn't care about it for you either. But you're right, of course, if he doesn't have the competence to know, anybody who's ignorant of something can't testify about what he's ignorant about. And if he tells you that he knows but you know that he doesn't know, then it's still no better than that. But what I'm talking about is people, all things being equal, who do have a cheskes kashrus, let's say, and we do rely on them. So that's the question. But getting back to my case of before, so the Mishnah and the Gemara in Kiddushin is the following case. You sent a shliach to be Makadosh Isha on your behalf, Kiddushin, and as a shliach. And then what happens, of course, is he goes forward. We assume that he, found a wife for the Mishaleach, but then he dies, before he can reveal to the Mishaleach who his wife is. Again, I don't think this has happened so many times in history, although I can't say that it's never happened. It doesn't really matter. It's a case on the Gemara that's to make a point. So now the problem is, you could say, okay, what's the big deal? At least in biblical law, he could marry more than one wife. So he should be able to go out. Okay, so he's married to somebody, but he doesn't know who. Let him go out and marry somebody else. But it's not so simple, because even though he could marry somebody else on a biblical level, not midrabanan and not after Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom, not today, but in the olden days. But there's still a problem, because he can't marry the sister of his wife, the mother of his wife, or the daughter of his wife. So if he doesn't know who his wife is, then he can't marry a second woman either, because for all he knows, that is, the sister, the mother, or the daughter, of the woman who the shliach, who unfortunately died without revealing, who he married him to. So that's a very fascinating case, right? So then there's a debate between the Ramban and the Ran on the following point. The Ramban says, listen, what would happen if an Eid Echad were to step forward, or the woman herself were to step forward and say, listen, and to say this is the woman that he got married to, or this is not the relative of this woman is not the woman, who the shliach was makadesh. Do you need two witnesses for that? If you had two witnesses, that would be great, right? Let's say you have only one witness who says this is the woman, not that woman. An Eid Echad nam bisurim. So in one sense, this is what I mean about the ambiguity, in the cases. Is that person, that one aid, is he testifying about the Maisa Kiddushin, which is a Davar Shebe'erva, which requires two witnesses, or is he just identifying who the wife is? Right? Just like identifying who the brother is in the case of Yibum. So my point is, there are 2 points I'm trying to make here. One is that there is a great deal of ambiguity in terms of what is considered Isurin, and what is considered either Mammon or Ishus, right, etc. So in a way, we had this already a little bit, because in our previous topic, we were talking about Eid Echad b'misa sabal. Let's say Eid Echad comes forward and he says, I was there when Nebuch, your husband, died, and I'm telling you he's dead. You can, you have the right to move on with your life. Right? The only way that we know, or the only evidence, the only information that her first husband is deceased comes from a single Eid. So we know that the rule is that we do believe Eid Echad b'misa sabal. The question is that Doraisa, Dorabanan, what's based on? So again, you have the same kind of discussion. The one Gemara says in the beginning of the 10th parak of Yevamos, Isha Rabba, that the reason that we believe the Eid Echad, even though it should be Ereva, should require 2 witnesses. The reason that we believe it is because of an extraneous consideration, and that is mitoch. This is what we talked about last or 2 weeks ago. Mitoch chomer shechmarta leha besofa hikalta leha betchila. Meaning she knows that she also better investigate, and she knows she better be very careful before she relies on this evidence, because what's going to happen if she rushes ahead? She takes his word for it, and it's not true, and then she remarries, has children, and then her first husband shows up. That's going to be a debacle, right? The child will be a mamzer. So according to one view of the Gemara, that's why we rely on the Eid Echad, and that's whatever. But there's another Gemara, and that's the Gemara in the end of Masachet Yevamos, which basically says that the reason that we rely on Eid Echad is because it's Milsa Davidi Ligluye. Milsa Davidi Ligluye means it's a matter which in the end will come out. You can't keep that kind of a truth doesn't remain hidden. Eventually the truth will come out. Meaning, eventually you'll find a body, or eventually there'll be stronger evidence one way or another. And therefore, some people explain, since it's Avidi Legluya, so it's Edus Angilui. Edus Angilui is considered an Echanama Bisur. So what I'm trying to show is that in addition to the question of, is there a qualitative difference between Edus in Mammon and Ishus and Nefashos and Nemanus and Isurim, and to what extent do we really rely 100% or without, with how deep is our conviction when it comes to Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim?
One witness into a matter satisfactory.
Say that again?
Usually 2 that are required. But there are certain circumstances in which there's only 1.
Yeah.
So, well, it makes it easier to prove, to convict someone, say, or to dismiss someone.
I mean, you're breaking up a little bit. It's hard to hear. It sounds to me like what you're saying is that the difference between 2 witnesses and 1 witness is a qualitative big difference. Is that correct? Yeah.
But Rabbi, why do we look at issues of Isur and Heter, or Heter and Isur, in a lower level compared to other issues where you definitely have to have minimum of 2 Eidim? Right. Why? Isur and Heter be a dangerous situation?
Well, number one, other people are and other forces are affected by things that require Eidos, whether it's Ishus, which affects a family and other people, or it's a Dine Mamonis, where you have a dispute, right? When it comes to Isur v'Heter, I'm eating kosher, I'm not eating kosher, that's a highly individualized issue. What?
No, Rabbi, you can continue.
No, I think she's trying to make a point, but I just can't. It's echoing, so I'm just not hearing it well. But I think before we were trying to say something about the difference between 1 witness and 2 witnesses, which I'll get back to. I think it's a great point, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Okay, so let's look at the Gemara here, and then we'll see what's going on. So there's one other thing I wanted to bring up that is connected to all this. I've raised several questions, about the ambiguity between Isur and Mammon, about how reliable Eid Echad is as Shnayim Eidim. Another closely related issue is the question of the source. What is the source of Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim? Is there a source of Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim? Okay. So in order to discuss all of this, let's look at the Gemara here.
Rabbi, didn't we start in Yavamis on that?
What's that?
Yavamis didn't we learn Yavamis together? But Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim by Iguna, right?
Yeah, that's we read that last week.
I'm saying no, but you're asking the source, wasn't that? I mean, isn't that one of the sources?
No, but the Gemara there didn't tell you how we know that Eid Echad is Neman B'Yisurim. The Gemara there gives you a source about how do you know that Eid Echad is Neman B'Misas Habal. I mean, the Gemara there says, why is Eid Echad B'Misas Habal Neman? It's not Isurim. And then the Gemara comes up with an explanation. Mito Chomer Shechmarta Leha B'Sofa. But the Gemara there doesn't tell you the source in Isurim for believing.
Got it.
Okay. Now the two main Gemaras about this are the Gemara in Yevamos and Pei Ches Amud Aleph, and the Gemara here in Gittin Beis Amud Beis and Gimel Amud Aleph. Okay, so let's go through this Gemara very quickly. We'll do the one in Beis Amud Beis. It's all the same, but it'll be helpful because Rashi is actually in Beis Amud Beis. So look here at the Gemara. The Gemara says the following. Ula Rabba, this is 5 lines down on Beis Amud Beis. Ula Rabba damar lefi she'ein b'kiyam lishma, according to Rabba, who says that the reason that we need remember b'fanei nektam, the proclamation of the shliach, when he brings the get, he has to say b'fanei nektam, in order to show that it was signed lishma. So the Gemara says, how can you believe a single agent, a single individual to say that? Liboy trey, you could require 2 witnesses. Why? Mididahava kol eduyos shebetorah, because this should be, this is about the kashrus, it's about the validity of the get. The get is a davar shebe'erva, it should require not namanus of an Eid Echad, but the edus of Shnayim. And therefore, it shouldn't be enough that one person says b'fanei nektam. You should require 2 people to say it. Says the Gemara, Eid Echad neman b'Yisurim. No, we believe one person on the basis of the principle of Eid Echad neman b'Yisurim. A single aid is believed when it comes to matters of ritual kashrus or things of that heter and iser. Says the Gemara, how could you say this is Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim? This is about a get. That's not Isurim. Eimer da Amrina Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim. When do we speak about Eid Echad having credibility in matters of Isurim? Kagon chaticha safek shel chelev, safek shel shuman. If, for example, you have a piece of meat, and you don't know whether it came from the kosher butcher shop or the non-kosher butcher shop. In other words, we don't know if this is kosher meat or non-kosher meat. We have just, it looks like meat. You can't tell by looking at it, right? So that is a case where we say the lowest chazak isura. We don't have any previous presumptive status, and that's a classic case of Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim. Meaning, if one person shows up and says, I know for a fact that this is kosher meat, I know that it came from this butcher shop and not from that one, or whatever, or I saw the shchita, or I saw the package that it was taken, whatever he says, that's called Eid Echad Neman B'Yisurim. We believe him in matters of saying this is kosher, because it doesn't have to override any other status. Aval hacha, but if we're talking about a get, a bill of divorce, she is already has a status. She's an Eishes Ish. We want to know whether that status changed. So have a davar shebe'erva. The ein davar shebe'erva pachos mishnayim. So in order to establish a change of the magnitude which affects her ability to marry someone else, meaning to to remove her from being an Eishes Ish to being Muteris L'Shuk, that's a Davar Shebe'erva, and that requires two witnesses. So then the Gemara says, the answer is Rov B'kiyin Hein. Right? Va'afilu Rabbi Meir, the Chayish L'miyuta, Stam Sifri D'Dainei Migmar K'miri, V'Rabbanan Hu Da'atzrach, V'Hachem Mishum Aguna Akilu B'Rabban. The Gemara says, you're right. If we needed real evidence here, if it was a real testimony, then we would have to hold out for two, because Ein Davar Shebe'erva Pakas Mishnayim, and she's Becheskas Eishes Ish. You just can't move forward on the basis of a single aid. However, the problem is a problem of Lishma, meaning, was this get prepared very specifically, with the intention of this husband and this wife, or not? And Stam Sofrei Dedaini, most Sofrim who would prepare a get are familiar with the requirement of Lishma. Therefore, the likelihood that this is Lishma is very, very high. It's so high that you don't really need further evidence. The further evidence is a rabbinic requirement, and considering that there's also a factor of Mishum Aguna Akilu B'Rabbanan, so therefore you can get away with a single aid. But had it been something more substantial, in Achanami, you would have required two witnesses. Now, in Gimel Amud Aleph, you have the exact same Shakla of the Gemara. Let's look at it there. Same thing. So the Gemara says, Ula Rava, the Amar Lefisha Ein Meidim Mitzuyim Lekaimo. This is 7 lines down from the top of the page on Gimel Amud Aleph. But remember, the other reason in the Mishnah that you require b'fanei nachtam, the reasoning of Rava is because we're concerned that there might be a challenge to the authenticity of the document, and then you'd have to authenticate it. And since it's travel and communication between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz in those periods was very difficult, so they said, we want to be proactive. We want to b'fanei nachtam. So the Gemara says, but according to Rava, if the reason that you need b'fanei nachtam is to authenticate the shtar, liboy trey, you should require two midahava akim shtaros di alma, because authenticating, verifying the contract is a matter of contract law, and that requires two witnesses. Says the Gemara, no, it's edachonem bisurim. Says the Gemara, it's the same exact discussion. Kigon chaticha safek chelev safek shuman. The low is chazik isura. When do we say edachonem bisurim? When there's no presumed state to override, right? But aval hacha is chazik isura deishasish. She is a married woman until we know otherwise, and have a davar shebe'erva. To change her status comes under the rubric of davar shebe'erva. Vein davar shebe'erva pakas mishnayim. Says the Gemara, and this is the Gemara that we've read already a million times. Bedinu de bikim shtaris nami loli bai k'dereish lakish damreish lakish ein machsum nasa b'shtar nasa k'mishnach reidusam bebezdin, right? And the only reason that you require edus is midrabanan and mishum aguna akila b'rabbanan. The issue that we've been discussing. I'm just sometimes going out of order for my own organizational reasons. So basically, what is the upshot of Beis Amud Beis and Gimel Amud Aleph? The Gemara, for a moment, in both cases, Lishma on Beis Amud Beis and Gimel Amud Aleph with regard to authentication, Kiyum Shtaros, the Gemara in both cases tested the idea that maybe this isn't Erva or Edus, maybe this is Isurim and Namanus. And in both cases, the Gemara rejected it, because the Gemara said if it's Chazik Isura and it's a Davar Shebe'erva, then Edachonem.
You need to have two. Yeah.
Okay. So, having said that, now let's look for a moment at the Rashi and the Tosas. This is very interesting. So, Rashi, first of all, if you look on Beis Amud Beis, Rashi says, if those of you have the Gemara, hopefully, Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Isurim. Rashi weighs in, like, how do you know that? Where's the source? Where's the source that two witnesses work in Erva and in Mammon and in Onshim and in Korban? because the Torah says al pi shnayim edim, right, on the word of two witnesses. How do you know? Where does it say in the Torah? Or does it say in the Torah anywhere that a single individual is relied upon in matters of Yisurim? Where does it say that? So Rashi addresses that without asking the question. He says, Shaharei hemina Torah kol echad v'echad miYisrael ala frashas truma ala shchita v'al nikar hagid v'achet. Rashi doesn't quote a pasuk. All he says is, factually, we rely on people every day when they inform us of things. Like if you
where does he get it from?
Exactly, where does he get it from? So in Rashi in Chulin on Daf Yudamid Beis, there Rashi quotes the pasuk that says, that in order to eat something you have to first shecht it. One second. And he says, well, that's the makar, because it doesn't say that you have to shecht it. One second. It doesn't say you have to shecht it and you have to have witnesses that you did a good job. This is Rashi and Chulin. The kol yachid v'yachid heminasa Torah. Every individual is believed by the Torah. V'zavachta mibkarecha umitzonecha. V'shachat is ben abakar. Right? V'akli kohanim al yado. V'lo iskiko lahamid edim b'davar. And then Rashi adds, this is very telling, V'lo hitzricha el la'onesh mamon o misas bezdin ularayas. The garmin and davar davar shabbat. Rashi says, maybe, he doesn't say it in so many words, but this is what the upshot is. Rashi says, maybe we're looking at this in the wrong way. Maybe what's important is what the Torah speaks about witnesses, but it only speaks about witnesses, right? When it talks about onshim, meting out punishment, korban, right? Ishus, mammon. That's the only time when the Torah speaks about eidos. So maybe the default is, if it's not one of these areas, then of course we can rely on people and trust them. And then what he's saying is the Torah says v'shachat, it says v'zavachta. It doesn't say that, we need to have, evidence, from beginning to end that everything was done kadasu kedin. It just says you have to shach the animal, and then people can eat from an animal that was shachted. But how do they know that everything went okay, other than the say-so of the shochet? So the combination of what the Torah does require in the context, but exclusively in the context of mammon and onshim, right, and the fact that the Torah doesn't make any particular statement about needing evidence to rely on shchita and zvicha and so on, says Rashi, would seem to imply that Erechonem Bisur. So according to Rashi in Chulin, Erechonem Bisur is based on pasuk, not really, kind of indirectly, but more to the point, it's a kind of a default logic, meaning, where the stakes are much greater, you require higher standards, and the implication is that when they're not, you don't. Rashi
but where do the Chumash, the Pasuk says, Al pi shnayim edim yakum davar.
Yeah.
It doesn't stipulate what it is, whether it is shchita or davar shebe'erva. Davar shebe'erva, we understand.
We have two psukim. One is
there is a general. The Pasuk is very general.
Right, but the context of the pasuk is in matters of ishus and onshim and mammon and the fashos. The context, not the pasuk itself. But let me say something else. Our Rashi in Gittin doesn't add that extra point that the chiddush is that you need two edim, but only in those cases. Rashi just says we know this to be the case. People rely on this. So let me go a step further. You're going to be even more unhappy with this one, but it's important to know that it's out there. Rashi in Yevamos, hold on one second. seems to go even further than Rashi here. Rashi says, "B'havadai pshitalon." It's certainly obvious. This samchinan aleha, that we rely on an eid echad. Kozman shelo nechshad, as long as that eid echad is not suspect in any way. Jacob asked me before about, somebody who's ignorant, who doesn't know the rules, or I mentioned somebody who is suspect, like he doesn't care about the rules. That's what Rashi is relating to, shelo nechshad. But then he adds, the ilav hachi ein lecha adam ochel mishel chavero. Ein lecha adam zolech al b'nei beso. Rashi says, if this were not the case, then no one could rely on anyone else, and you couldn't rely on your family members. Meaning, you go home after a hard day's work, right? And and one of your family members, provides you with a nice repast, provides a dinner or supper, and if not for Nechanem and Bisurim, say, I'm sorry, I can't eat that until I have evidence, that it's kosher. Do we ever find such a thing, that you can't rely on your family members, when it comes to matters of kashrus? So what is Rashi saying? Is Rashi saying, we know this to be the case because lo matzino, that you can't rely on people? Or is Rashi saying, we're not happy about it because objectively speaking, relying on an eid echad is a risk, unlike Shnayim Eidim. However, b'makom shi efshar, it's a din she'ena tzibur yicholim lamod bo. If you're going to tell me that we need, constant evidence of everything that we do and everything that we eat, it's not workable. Maybe it's a kind of like dirachel darchei noam v'chol nesivaseha shalom, right? It would turn everybody into, suspicious, it would create a lot of friction. It's just no way to live. So is this a b'diavad even though it's a risk? Or is this Rashi's way of saying, we never found this, so obviously this is the case? This Rashi in Yevamos goes further. If you had to put it in a hierarchy, I would say Rashi in Chulin is the most forthcoming. He quotes a pasuk. He contrasts it, with the need for Shnayim Eidim, which is limited to, Onshim and Easter and and Arayos and so on. Then you have Rashi in Gittin who says, we find that people rely on each other. And then you have Rashi in Yevamos who says, you have to rely on people, otherwise you just couldn't make do. So it's interesting that Tosas Yeshanim on the side and printed on the side of the page in Yevamos says, just because it's problematic doesn't mean that it isn't true. Almost what the Chazan was asking, meaning it would be unpleasant, but just because something is unpleasant doesn't mean it isn't necessary. So what does that mean? The Balei Tosas have a different suggestion. They say that the source of a Nechad Neman B'Yisurim is the pasuk that says V'safrala, that a woman counts, the days of her menstrual uncleanliness, right, and until she goes to the mikvah, and that's a very personal, private, kind of thing, and her husband relies upon her. So the Torah says v'safrala. That's the source of Eidecha Neman B'Yisur. That's the view of the Balei Tosas. Rashi, on the other hand, doesn't have a makar. So we just don't know what to make of it. You don't need a makar because it's obvious and it's logical. Or even though there's a risk here, there's no choice, because of Derachel Darchei Noam or whatever, or B'mokom She'efshar, you have to rely on it. But there's another debate between Rashi and Tosos, and with this we'll conclude for today, but we'll try to get through this. Rashi says, what is the case, back in Gittin, on base on base, what is the case of Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim? Rashi says, Shari Amina Torah Kol Echad V'Echad MiYisrael, Al Hafrashas Truma, Shchita, Nikar Hagid, and Chelev. That it seems like the Torah believes people when it comes to say, oh, I separated Trumas and Maestros. It's not Tevel anymore. I did a proper Shchita, or I brought it from the proper butcher store, or Nikur Hagid V'Achela, right? Tosos, if you look at Tosos now, Dibra Hamaschil Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. So Tosos quotes Rashi, Piers B'Kuntras, Sharei Mina Torah Kol Echad V'Echad Al Hafrashas Truma U'Shchita V'Nikar Hagid. Then Tosos comments, that's end quote. Below Hayalo Lahaskir Hafrashas Truma U'Shchita. The Bahanu Ne'eman Afagav Dis Chazak Yisura Yishum Dibiyado L'Takno. Kemoshe Pirsha Kontus B'Samuch. So this is the problem. Argamar is when Argamar was considering the possibility that Lishma or Kiyum Shtaros is only Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim. Why did the Gemara reject it? Because they said, listen, Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim doesn't seem to work Keneged is Chazak Yisura. When you have a presumption going in the other direction. If she's an Eishes Ish, then you're not going to, change her status on the say-so of a single aid. B'Yisurim. You need more than that. What does it sound? It sounds like at least our Gemara is saying that Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim is not Ne'eman Keneged is Chazak Yisura. That you will not believe a single witness to override a presumed status. Correct? But the cases that Rashi quotes as cases of Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim are all cases of Chazak Yisura. For example, what is Hafrashas Truma? What is Hafrashas Truma? Tzvua, produce of Eretz Yisrael, right? Until you're mafresh, until you separate Trumos to give to the Kohen, right? That produce is called Tevel, and it's prohibited to eat. You're not allowed to eat it. More severe than eating chazer. People just don't know about it so much. But as Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik likes to say, it doesn't have the taboo, of chazer, but it has a more chamor prohibition, than chazer. Meaning the tvu of Eretz Yisrael is presumptively tevel. That's its cheskas iser. You're not allowed to eat it. You have to do something in order to eat it. You have to be mafresh trumas of Maestros. So if the Gemara here is telling us that cheskas iser it does not allow Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim, how can Rashi say that the example of Eid Echad Ne'eman B'Yisurim is a case of cheskas iser? Or take the other case, shchita, right? The animal, when it's alive, and you couldn't eat the animal if it wasn't affected properly, if it was dead.
Okay.
Because it would be nevela. It would be either Avram Menachai or nevela. What is it that what is it that allows the animal to be eaten? What is it that allows the animal to be eaten? The Maisa Shchita. That changes its status. So if somebody says it was a Shchita, and it was, now it's kosher meat, aren't they saying Eid Echad, isn't that Eid Echad Keneged is Chazak Yisura?
No, I'm done.
Or Nikar Agid, or Nikar HaChelef, meaning what? There's non-kosher food that is mixed in with kosher food as part of the mix, and therefore you're not allowed to eat it. Correct? Until you cut it out, until you identify it, and you remove it. But identifying it and removing it is a change. Until that happens, there's this Chazak Yisura. So Tosas asking a very powerful question. How can Rashi say, now if you look at Rashi himself, he addresses this, as Tosas points out. Look at the Rashi below his Chazak Yisura. I'm sorry, no. Hacha is chazik isura. Because hach is chazik, hach is asa. In this woman, there is a chazaka of isur, eshes,
And then
ish.
we'll go have double.
And then he adds, umitavelu shchita lo gamrinan la. We can't derive from tevel and shchita that you can apply echad neman bisurim even in this chazik isura. You know, Amrina v'yavamos, the hasa b'yada l'taknon, lefikach neman b'yada. So Rashi says, basically, he's quoting the Gemara in Yevamos. The Gemara in Yevamos says that in the case of Shita, the reason that an echad is neman is because it's biyado l'taknon. What does it mean, biyado l'taknon? Meaning he has the ability. It doesn't depend on somebody else or something else. He has it in his power to change the status quo. If he could change the status quo, that's called biyado l'taken. But we believe him even though it's his chazik isur. Tosas says, now getting back to that, Tosas says that's fine, but that's not an example of a echad isur. That's an example of biyado. Are you with me? Go back to Tosas for a minute. Again, if we
Who is making so much noise there?
yeah. If we could, yeah. V'hacha amar be'ayisha rabba, u'shchita afal gav, the hashtem b'yada l'takno mikara ha b'yada l'shkot. Even shchita, even if right now he can't do the shchita, but he could hire a shochet, he could learn to do shchita. Dim lokena ma'ay mehemen, kibid is chazik isura, the lo matzina b'shem makom she'yitztarech begadol echad omed al gaba, u'maisim b'chol yom de mehemen, afal gav de lo shayach, rov mitzunei tzashchita mumchen hein. The details are not important. So basically, according to Tosas, what's the source of Eid Echad Neman Bisurim? B'im Tomer Minol on the Eid Echad Neman Bisurim. Yeishlomer the Alfina Minida the Darshin B'Perak Hamadir v'Safar Lali Atzma. We'll read the end of Tosas a little bit later. So what's interesting is the following. Just to sum up for a moment. Not what we said before, what we're saying now. The Gemara says Eid Echad Neman Bisurim. Rashi says in Chulin, it's a svara. The Torah doesn't say you need anything beyond shchita. They don't need evidence that there was shchita. You just need shchita. Moreover, the Torah spells out the requirement of two edim only in onshim and in mamon and in the fashos. Rashi here in Gittin doesn't say that, but he also seems to say it's a svara. He just says, Eid Echad is neman bisurim. Sharei Amina Torah kol echad v'yachad mi-Yisrael. Yevamos goes further and says, if we didn't believe you, then you wouldn't be able to trust your family members even in matters of shchita, and that would be intolerable. And the Tosas Shalom says, just because something is difficult doesn't mean it isn't true. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two, on the other hand, Tosas says, Eid Echad Neman Bisurim, it's learned out from a pasuk, the Safra in the context of Nida. So already have an interesting argument between Rashi in three places against Tosas. Tosas says this in a bunch of places also. Okay. But there's another argument, and that is Rashi exemplifies Eid Echad Neman Bisurim with the case of Shchita, Truma, Nikor HaChelev, Nikor HaGid, and Tosas says that's not a good example because those are cases of the Chazik Isura where Eid Echad Neman Bisurim doesn't work. The only reason we believe so. Now, again, Tosas doesn't argue with Rashi that we believe the individual when he says Hifrashti Truma or Shachatati, as a basar. We do believe him. However, Tosas says the Gemara says in Yevamos, the reason we believe him is because it's biyado, not because of Eid Echad Neman Bisurim. But Rashi, who admits that it's mitam biyado in the continuation of our Gemara, earlier had said that this is the example, this is the paradigm of Eid Echad Neman Bisurim. So what's going on? So the answer seems to be as follows. Our Gemara says, Eidach Hanem Bisurim doesn't work against Keneged Ischazak Isura. And the Gemara in Yevamos points out that in the case of Shchita and Trumos, etc., we do believe him even against Ischazak Isura when it's biyad, right? Tosas understood that those are two completely different categories. There's one thing called Eidach Hanem and Bisurim, when there is no opposition of a chazaka. In other words, there's no presumptive state where it's like Safek Chelev, Safek Shuman. You have a piece of meat, you don't know anything about it. It has no origin, nothing to override. Tosa says that's called Eidach Hanem and Bisurim. And anytime this is Chazak Yisur, that doesn't work. Even if it's Chazak Yisur, Biyado works, that's called Biyado. Biyado, says Tosos, and this is clearer even in the Rush here in Gittin and Parakani Zakin in the 5th parak. Biyado is a category in its own right. If I have the ability to make a certain change and to put things right, to make it kosher, to do shchita, to do afrashas truma, to do nikar agid, then that capacity makes me a bailim. It makes me a force in this discussion, not just an observer. And as a bailim, I have extra nemanos. Mashal Mad Davardome, the Gemara says in the end of Masachet Kiddushin that, for example, a dayan, a judge, is neman to say, 10 minutes ago or an hour ago or a week ago, I found in favor of Ruvain, against Shimon. And a chaya, a midwife, is believed to say, this child belongs to this woman and that child belongs to the next woman. And a storekeeper is believed to say, this is the person who I sold it to, not that other person. Meaning, what the Gemara seems to be saying is that people who are in a unique position where they are participants or they have special knowledge or special interest in the case, sometimes are granted or accorded greater credibility as well. Tosas thinks, and the Rosh think, that that's what biyado is. And therefore, even though it's a chazak isura, to say there was a shchita, to say there was a proper hafrashas truma, to say there was nikar hagid and nikar achelev, we believe that person because biyado. That's not Eidach Hanem and Bisurim, that's biyado.
But doesn't it also make you an Agei B'Davar, or it's not an Agei B'Davar?
No, because it doesn't at this point. I mean, it's not, there's no negios, it's just, we just believe you that, especially like the Daya and the Chaya, this person also, they're not testifying about themselves, they're testifying about the status of the object. There doesn't have to be negios involved. Most of the time, there's not. Anyway, so, but obviously the way Rashi understood the Gemara in Yevamos, so that there's no question against him, is in a completely different way. Rashi said, listen, this is all Eidach Hanem and Bisurim. But the Gemara says if it's a Chazak Yisura, we don't say Eidach Hanem Bisurim. Says Rashi, the pshat is, if it's biyado, that neutralizes the Cheskas Isur. Because there's a presumed Isur right now, but you could take care of that easily. It doesn't stick. It's not part of the definition of what you're dealing with. You could easily make that go away. It's biyado l'takein. Biyado l'takein is not a basis of a new nemanos. Biyado l'takein is a prat, it's a detail in Eidach Hanem and Bisurim. We say Eidach is Hanem and Bisurim, and therefore if there's no Cheskas Isur, we believe him. And if there is a Cheskas Isur, but it's biyado, so then that neutralizes, then it's as if there's no Cheskas Isur, because we can wave away the Cheskas Isur. It's not really a formidable factor. We can get rid of it anytime we want. Says Rashi, the real case of Eidach Hanem and Bisurim is either when there's no Cheskas Isur or when there's biyado, which makes Cheskas Isur irrelevant and gets you back to the starting point of Eidach Hanem and Bisurim. So that's what the Chidushei Haran and the Ma'arik in Shoresh Ayin Beis, that's how they explain this Rashi. They say, even though Tosas seems to be asking a good question, that's because Tosas thinks that biyado, there are two different things, there are two different categories. One is called Eidach Hanem Be'isurim, and that only works b'makom she'ein cheskas iser. And then there's something else, and that is when there's a cheskas iser and you can no longer rely on the principle of eidechad neman be'isurim, there is a reliance on a kind of bailus based on biyado. And Rashi says that's not the pshat. The pshat is it's all eidechad neman be'isurim, but eidechad neman be'isurim in order to override the problem of cheskas iser or to trivialize a particular cheskas iser, it has to be something which is biyado. Okay, so having said that, where does this leave us in terms of the question of the relationship between Eidus and Nemanus? So according to Tosfos, eidechad neman be'isurim will never override cheskas iser. That's a very big limit in Nemanus. That shows that Nemanus is very shaky. It's a risk. And we're not willing to take that risk to override some other factor like cheskas iser. In other words, there is a fundamental difference between Nemanus and Eidus. It's not just that where the stakes are lower, therefore the threshold is lower, for total reliance. It's that in one case we consider it to be factual and there's no safek, and in the other case there is a safek. There's just a resolution through the nemanus of an eidechad. It isn't that different, according to Tosfos, than it's not that different, according to Tosfos, than the relationship to a rov or a chazaka. For example, we say ruba v'chazaka, ruba adif, but maybe not always. So too, you have an eidechad. It runs against a chazaka. It might not work. So on the other hand, this I'll leave you. The Ramban here in Gittin and in Yevamos and the Rajba in Yevamos take the position that lahalacha eidechad neman be'isurim even against this chazik yisura. It sounds like the Ramban and the Rajba think that eidechad is a more formidable, vadai, reliable source. Let me give you another example with this will end. Tosas here, we'll discuss it next time, suggests that even if eidechad is neman be'isurim, it's only lahatir, not lesor. In other words, to permit something, says Tosas. If you look here, I'll just read the line. Look at Tosfos midi dahava akol eduyos shebatorah. Yeah. So if you go to the miu yesh lomar, this is toward the middle of the Tosfos. The hochi kamar eidechad neman be'isurim lahatir. Hodboy trey hanimili lesor dechad lav kol kamini. Tosfos suggests that the whole rule of eidechad neman be'isurim is only to permit something, but to prohibit, you always need two witnesses. So if eidechad neman be'isurim was totally reliable in the same way that we rely on two witnesses in Dinei Mamonis, we rely on one witness or one neman in isurim, you can't distinguish between isur and heter. Just like in Dinei Edus is no difference. If the Edom come to court and they say that it's permissible, or if the Edom come to court and they say that it's prohibited, in both cases we follow their psak because what they're telling us is that this is factual. If the Surim was considered factual for this lower level, issue, you couldn't distinguish between Laheter and Leisa. Interesting, the Ramban rejects it. The Ramban also says two things. Number one, we don't make that distinction. Number two, if we were, we would make the distinction in the opposite way. We'd say, you know what? It's easier to be oser than to be matir. From a risk aversion point of view, that's certainly true, right? It's always easier to be stringent than to be lenient. Anyways, so what we've seen already, and we will continue with this in Mirz Hashem next week, is that there is very lively debate about the categories and status of eidechad be'isurim, and we'll talk more next week about how that relates to, the parallel of Eidos and Mammon. Any questions? Looks like some people want to ask.
Shakar, Rabbi, thank you so much.
The concept, one last thing, the Eid Echad Nemen B'Surin, which is eliciting so much debate and argument. Isn't it possible that Eidos in that case, that concept is a form of chazaka, a halachic chazaka, that basically speaking, we're debating not about the quality of the Eidos, but when one aid is sufficient based on circumstances. So it's kind of it's Eidos is chazaka in a certain way. That's whereas obviously.
Right.
Yeah.
I was saying before, I don't think the Eidos isn't chazaka, but what I'm saying is the more you look at it as not, not that within
It's not
application, it's totally reliable. It's more that just like we rely on a probability, or just like we rely on a presumption.
Right. It's like
we'll rely on one aid, acknowledging that he's fallible because there's only one of him. I'll give you the example. I've mentioned it in the past.
It would be like rove. It's the rove of Eidos, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's
But
a
again,
probable.
it's
It doesn't necessarily fit in to a hierarchy of Eidos. It's more a halachic concept. We're stuck with one.
That's what I mean. It's nemonus, not Eidos.
Right.
And that's
Okay.
qualitatively a lower category, one which never says anything with certitude, but says that you can rely on, something with a high degree of likelihood. Now, in this case, it isn't probability. It's for example, I'll just give you the Nesivos has a famous line where he says, how come Eid Echad isn't good enough for Dinei Mamonos? So you could have said, because you need more, but he says something fascinating, and we'll see next week, hopefully, that the Tashbit says something very similar. He says, from a Nemanos point of view, this is a bit of a Kiddush, but it's a fascinating Kiddush. He says, from a Nemanos point of view, maybe we would rely on Eid Echad, and that would be enough. However, there's another problem, and that's people's delusion or their fantasy. He says there's always a possibility that somebody's trying to be honest, but he's just, delusional in general or about this particular, issue. So you need the second aid, where the threshold is higher, because people don't share the same delusion. Two people, are not both going to have the same fantasy, that tricks them. It's a little bit, I always, try to compare it to the opening lines of Tolstoy's, Anna Karenina, but, not all, I think I've mentioned in the past, but, all happy families, he said, I don't think it's true, but half is true. All happy families are happy in the same way, but all unhappy families, are unhappy in different ways. So, delusional people are, delusional in different ways. You don't get the same delusion from two people. So the Nesiva says the reason you need two Eidim for Eidim as Eidos is to filter out, not lying, but to filter out fantasy, inaccuracy.
So maybe
Now, because then you could say, what about Isurim? So on the one hand, that would lead you to think, well, most from a credibility point of view, it would have been enough even for Mamonos and Isur and Ishus and whatever. So it's good enough here. On the other hand, maybe what about the fantasy part? Maybe you're just not as concerned about that, because there aren't two people and other people's stakes. It's just more of a personal status.
So Rabbi, that this boils down to not only credibility but reliability.
Yes.
We know that Eidim make mistakes across the board, and they don't even.
I was saying before, the presumption in the halacha is because there are two, and because we already have very high standards of interrogation and high standards of excluding interested parties, etc. So the presumption is that it is 100% effective until we know it isn't. But you're right. What we're trying, the reason that we have those kind of standards, and where there's a whiff of problem, the reason that we're so forceful about it is because it's not just exactly what you said. I like the way you said it. It's not just about credibility, it's about reliability, meaning we want to make sure that people are not dishonest, but we also want to make sure simply that they're accurate and that they're not, sincerely, misled. So that's a challenge.
So basically deluding themselves, but not
Yeah.
not delusional, not delusional, but they're deluding themselves.
That could be whatever.
They
That's
think
already a
they saw
nuance.
something,
Right.
and in fact they didn't.
Yeah, no, right, exactly. But it's a brilliant insight by the Nesivos to say that. Meaning the Nesivos is basically saying, it's called, he doesn't say delusional either. He says bidadami. Bidadami means their imagine, meaning he says, that's what I thought it was, meaning his imagination got the best of him. But what we mean is he's not accurate. It's there's a very interesting line in the Rimigash in Masachet Bava Basra when it talks about him Nogea B'davar. Jacob was asking me about Nogea before, somebody who has an interested party. So he said, is it possible, says the Rimigash, that an interested party also just doesn't see it accurately? We know today that is, a very real possibility, that sometimes people are so invested in certain things, it can really affect their accuracy, not just their honesty and rely, but their accuracy.
Rabbi, that's the problem with science. I can tell you, it's the problems with scientific research. People want to believe, and whatever they see, as long as it supports their hypothesis, they will continue.
Well, that's why there's better rigor and lesser rigor, right? But there have been, let's say, a lot of flaws, let's say, in scientific testing, because people, you're right, because either the people have an interest in a certain theory or thesis, or hopefully good scientific testing is, I don't know if it's infallible, but hopefully it's at a very high standard. But there have been many, as we know, in drugs and in invention.
That's my area, and I can tell you, that people literally fall in love with their hypothesis, and
it sways them.
They close themselves out, and basically, they actually do become delusional.
Right. No, it's fascinating.
In many ways, it's really,
and unintentionally good people with integrity.
Oh yeah. There's nothing in many instances. It's not malicious at all.
Right.
Not malicious at all. No, not at all.
Amazing.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Always have a good evening, everyone, and to be continued.
Thank you.
We'll figure out.
Thank you very much. Yasher Koach.